We are here with composer and musician Bear McCreary talking about his memories, his long collaboration, and his personal relationship with legendary composer Elmer Bernstein. Bear, thanks a lot for being with us.
Of course. Thanks for letting me be involved with this.
Well, you met Elmer at high school and he encouraged you to study at USC Thornton School of Music. How do you recall that moment?
I'll never forget it. I met Elmer through an acquaintance that. Well, there's no short version of the story. I'm going to have to tell you the long version of the story.
Okay.
So I grew up in Bellingham, Washington, which is this little town just south of the Canadian border on the Puget Sound up in Washington State. And there's the local Rotary Club there, and they would do this thing called Student of the Month, where they would take a high school junior each month, and it's essentially a thing for your resume that you can put on when you're applying to college that you were selected because of your GPA or whatever as Student of the Month. So the Rotary Club selected me, and I went, and they introduced me to this room full of super old guys, and they said, "This is Bear McCreary. He wants to study film music. He's thinking about going to USC," and blah blah blah. That was they introduced me, and at the end of the event, this guy comes up to me and introduces himself, and he was involved with the boating association there in because there's a marina in the town, and he goes, "Oh, I have a friend who keeps a sailboat here, and he works in the industry. Maybe you'd like to meet him sometime." And even by the time I'm 16, I'm already thinking like, okay, whatever, man. Like, it's probably somebody who does like local access weather reports or something,
Uh-huh.
And he says, "Have you heard of Elmer Bernstein?" And my jaw drops. I mean, I worshipped Elmer's music, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And of course, I said, yes, I would love to meet Elmer. So I made a cassette tape of a lot of the music I had been writing at the time, and which was a lot of stuff that I'd been just sequencing on a Yamaha synthesizer that I had a little onboard sequencer, and then eventually I got a Windows, I think it was a Windows 95 machine. Anyway, it was running like master tracks. I would do these little MIDI sequences to realize my ideas. So I sent a cassette tape of this stuff along to Elmer, and he listened to it because his friend asked him to. And I would find out years later that he would receive dozens of demo tapes every month, and he wouldn't. As a policy, he wouldn't listen to any of them. So the fact that he even listened to mine was incredibly fortunate. And so when the next time he was up on his sailboat, because he would go sailing in the summer in the Puget Sound, mm-hmm. We arranged for me to meet him on his boat. And I went out, and my mom took me shopping, and I bought me a new suit and new shoes and a nice tie. To this day, like I don't know if I've worn a tie since, but man, it's like, and I went onto his boat, and Elmer was so casual and just sort of super friendly, and he was wearing like a sweatshirt with a pig on it or something, and had his little kind of moccasin slippers. He was totally chilled out, and I remember him commenting on my wardrobe at some point, just saying like, "Oh wow, you didn't need to dress for the occasion," or something. He made some comment about, how overdressed I was for what was this very casual meeting. But we spoke for a few hours, and from that point on, kept in close contact. And eventually, I started sitting in on his classes when I got into USC, and then started working with him, and the rest is history.
Yeah, because after finishing your studies at Thornton, you continue your career with him. I mean, how come you became his sort of protege or something like that?
That's a really good question, and I honestly don't know the answer. I think he heard something in my music, and he saw something when he met me, but he really took an interest in helping me figure out what I needed to do. He asked me the day we met if I had studied theory, counterpoint, orchestration, harmony, music history, notation, and it was no, 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 no. I hadn't studied any of these things. I'd taken piano lessons, and I played in my jazz band, and the rest I just picked up by ear. So he encouraged me to learn the tools of the trade, and when I got to USC, which he wrote me a letter of recommendation, which I'm sure made a big difference. But when I got into USC and I started studying these things, I was sitting in on his classes, and every year I would go to his class and I would do the assignments, and he would hear what I was doing. And I have to think that he heard something, and I can't honestly tell you what it was, because there were a lot of young up-and-coming composers that, wanted access to him or even got access to him via USC. But he definitely took me under his wing and taught me a lot about the business, but also just about life and what it means to have a life in music. I think I learned more about that from being around him than from anyone else.
How was he as a teacher on a daily basis, on every given day? How was learning with him?
There were two sides of it. I sat in on his classes, and he was a very dedicated educator, and he was his whole life. I think there's very few composers as successful as him that have taken so much time to connect with young musicians and young composers, and every musician that's ever played for him even told stories of how supportive he was and how encouraging he was, and that that clearly was a passion of his. For me, the experience was a little different, just because I worked behind the scenes on a number of things, and I got to know him personally, and I spent a lot of time at the house and got to know his family, and so the learning experience, I was learning all the time. I was learning even when he wasn't teaching, even when I'm just near him and I'm in the other room and I'm sorting through old documents, and he gets bored and sits at the piano and just starts noodling around. I'm learning when I hear him play and what he's capable of just messing around. I mean, and just the fact that even at that age, he was approaching 80 at that time, that he still had that desire to sit at the piano and just experiment. That says a lot. And that informed me a lot about what it means to be a musician, So I keep going back to these sort of personal life lessons, but that's what I really learned from him. I mean, the musical stuff I learned by listening to his music, and it was reinforced by being able to ask him direct questions about it. Questions like, why did you start using the ondes marteneau in heavy metal, and what was it that drew you to it? Or why did you use a accordion in To Kill a Mockingbird? These are questions that I could just ask him. So that access was amazing. But just being around him and watching his approach to life and music, that's what I really learned, and those are experiences I will carry with me forever.
Okay, now you are involved in tons of super exciting projects. But when you're composing music now for movies on TV, is there any particular Elmer's lesson that keeps you on track today?
It would be hard to narrow it down to only one. If I had to narrow it down to only one, actually, yeah, I can. There's one lesson that he continually hammered home that I think about every time I start a new project. And he was talking about, in scoring features, you often have the main title. And even before the main title, sometimes you have like the logos, or you have some studio presents card. You have these 2 or 3 seconds before the movie really gets going and before the audience is really paying attention to the story. And he always said that is the prime opportunity to create something unusual, to use a sound that immediately takes you to a different place, because the audience is more vulnerable. They're more susceptible in those 2 seconds.
That's true.
You look at a score like Hawaii, and it starts with this ethnic Polynesian percussion. You look at some of his jazz scores. starting off with a hi-hat, Man with the Golden Arm. Like, no one had done that before. You look at To Kill a Mockingbird, starting with just this solo piano that's played with one finger. It was so simple. And all of this thematic material develops out of that. I think about that quite frequently, actually, as when I work on a main title for a TV series or I work on a main title for a movie, and I think about, okay, what's the first sound you hear? Because that really is a very unique opportunity. You have a chance here to make a statement that will have a bigger impact than if you do it 2 minutes later or a half hour later. And so I think about that. That's one of many, many specific lessons that I think about on an almost daily basis.
Okay, that's great. Let's go back a little bit to your personal relationship, because lots of people in the industry describe Elmer as a very humble and kind person. How is he in the personal side?
I think those are good words to describe him. I think those are very accurate terms. Humble, it's interesting. He knew how good he was, and he knew how important he was, and he also knew how he needed to be treated. So I think that the people that commented on how humble he was are the people that treated him respectfully. And that is what I think, another thing I sort of learned is that when he was treated well, he was very humble and very accommodating. And he in my tenure with him, I saw him work with first-time filmmakers and show extreme patience and generosity. Here's a guy whose career had crossed the 50-year mark, and yet he's still very patiently sitting down with a first-time filmmaker and discussing their ideas and hearing them out and changing their perspective, educating them. On the flip side of it, if you didn't treat Elmer that way, if he felt that you were not respecting the amount of work that he had done to get to where he was, he had a short patience for that, and so it was interesting for me to see him at that point in his career, because there were things he could get away with that I knew as a young composer. I thought, man, I could never do that. You got to be Elmer Bernstein to be able to say that, So there were, there's two sides of it. But yes, I mean, I think he was very humble and very sweet and very generous as a default,
Okay. One of your assignments working with him was to reorchestrate one of his most memorable scores, Kings of the Sun. How do you remember that experience?
That experience was amazing. It was my first professional job doing anything remotely musical. And he always got a lot of fan requests for a soundtrack album for Kings of the Sun, which was a South American adventure pick starring Yul Brynner. And it came out in 1968 and had kind of been forgotten. And at the time, there was no DVD release. There was no home video release. There were no cable broadcasts. This movie had not seen the light of day since 1968. And yet, fans were always asking him for it. They wanted to hear it in concert. They wanted to have it on album. So the sad truth is that the scores and the master recordings, as was common in the time, were the property of the studio, and they had destroyed them all, which was very common and sad and a topic of discussion for another day. But the thing that remained were Elmer Bernstein's handwritten sketches that he had actually used to compose the score. So he gave me access to those and told me to reorchestrate the film from top to bottom. And actually, at this time, it was sort of a task to keep me busy because I was house sitting his house while he was gone on the sailboat one summer. So I was working in his studio, staying at his house and walking the dogs and kind of taking care of the house and making sure everything was okay. And then spending my days orchestrating this score from his handwritten notation. Now, I want you to think about the learning experience for a young composer to see Elmer Bernstein's handwritten notation as it came out of his mind. This is what it looked like. Reorchestrating it the way you think he meant it, and then getting down to sit with him personally and having him correct your mistakes. At the end of the summer, he came back and we went through the whole score. And, he knew what he would have done at the time and what he remembered doing, and gave me a bunch of corrections, and I made the corrections, and we were done. And it was recorded during the last recording sessions of his life in Europe, and was put out in a box set. So it was pretty amazing, a crash course in orchestration and really getting into the details with a master.
Great. How was first learning with him and later on working for him? Did you find big differences between the two phases or stages?
There was no difference because he was very generous, and he paid me to do the orchestration because it was real work. But he was beyond generous because he really took the time to educate me and show me the things to do beyond just what needed to be done to get that score up and running. He was constantly just educating me. So there was no difference. Even when I was working for him in a more bookkeeping sense, I organized the entire collection of documents that are now housed at the USC library. All his scores and parts and newspaper clippings and clippings from the trades and photos and handwritten documentation, concert programs. They were all very loosely organized in a big closet. So one summer, my job was to organize it all. And I got a bunch of boxes, and I went through it and put them all in the places where they went. And in a lot of cases, there were scores that either had abbreviations for titles that I didn't recognize, or that just had no titles on them at all. And so I would have to sit there and read the score and try to figure out what score it was. And very often I could figure it out, but there were other times that I just couldn't. And at the end of every day, after I'd been in there about 6 or 7 hours, Elmer would come in for the last hour or two and sit down with me and help me organize the things that I couldn't place. And what I ended up having were these incredible stories about his life. As if there was a newspaper clipping that I didn't know what box it went in, he would look at it and these memories would just start coming out. Stories of people he worked with and the way things used to be in the studio system. And having that kind of access was amazing. And after a while, I started realizing that I could get these great stories out of him. So sometimes I would come across a score that I knew what it was, but I thought, I've always wanted to ask him about this. I'm going to leave this out and just see where the stories go. And he would tell me these amazing, amazing stories. So there was an educational part of it too. I mean, he was reminiscing, and I was learning about his life and the craft and the art and the business of it. But it was all sort of mixed up in the job. There was never a point at which I stopped learning from him and started working for him. If anything, I mean, there's a lot of people that have done a lot of work for him and were a part of his production team for a long time. And I don't consider myself one of those people. I really think of myself as sort of, a protege that he taught, and he sort of gave me a lot of guidance and then set me free onto the world,
I'm pretty sure that Elmer's inspiration is behind many of your scores, but is there any particular score, movie, television, anything that you can say, well, behind this score is Elmer's spirit? Is there any particular one?
Oh, man. Well, there's a lot. But I think if I had to be specific, personally, I think that my tribute to Elmer's sense of melody and harmonic progressions is more obvious in my theme for a video game called Dark Void, than in any other place. I think if fans listen to the opening track of Dark Void, they would know that actually I listened to a lot of Elmer.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
In fact, one quick little story about that.
Yeah.
I grew up listening to Elmer's music and Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams, and my early career was spent doing Battlestar Galactica, which for the most part was very percussive, very cold, very ethnic. It was the opposite of that kind of music. And when I got hired to do Dark Void, I realized I had an excuse to do the kind of swashbuckling, lyrical adventure score that I'd always wanted to write, but I'd been doing Battlestar for so long that I'd forgotten how. So I started listening to Elmer, especially Elmer, for about a month, just trying to like reacclimate myself to that style of writing. And the music that came out of that was Dark Void.
That's great. Well, the last one, recently you published on Facebook lots of Elmer quotes, part of his philosophy as composer, so to speak. Have you ever thought about writing a book or something like that about his life and career?
You know, I certainly have, but I actually, you know, I don't even know if I would be qualified to. I mean, I certainly hope that a book is forthcoming because he led an amazing life. But I certainly started with those Elmer quotes. I thought that those, I mean, a book is just sort of a daunting project for me right now, but yeah. I did think that starting with those quotes was a way to condense all those years of classes down to these 25 little gems that I thought were relevant to composers today. So maybe that's a starting point, and who knows what the future will bring.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, that's all. We are out of time. Bear, we'd like to thank you very, very much for your time and kindness. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be a part of this retrospective of Elmer, and I wish you guys all the best with the piece.
Absolutely. See you soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.